Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you're back for this third session of the Right to Vote. And before I introduce today's speaker, we'd love to know about the 500 or so of you, or actually Megan said closer to 600 today. If you're joining us, please tell us in the chat where you're from. And also remember that your questions and comments should all be put in the chat, and we will get to those later. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker. Rebecca Edwards received her Ph.D. in 1995 from the University of Virginia. Her research interests focus on the post-Civil War era and include electoral politics and the history of women and gender. She teaches courses at Vassar College on the 19th century United States, women in the US in up to 1890, and the American West. Professor Edwards is the author of Angels in the Machinery, Gender in American Party Politics from the Civil War to the Progressive Era, and New Spirits, Americans in the Gilded Age, 1865 to 1905. She is co-author of America's History. Professor Edwards is currently working on an article about US politics in the 1880s and a collection of documents on the march of Jacob Coxey's army of the unemployed in 1894. She is beginning research for a project about the significance of women's economic and reproductive roles in US political development. Having looked at the electoral process from a historical perspective with her history students at Vassar, Professor Edwards is now part of the process herself, having campaigned for and won a seat in the Dutchess County Legislature. Yay, Professor Edwards.
Thank you.
So here's Professor Edwards.
Thank you so much. I really am honored to be here today, and I'm so just amazed at the online community that you've created here. Despite the travails and difficulties of the last year or so, this is one of the amazing opportunities for people to get together online, even though we're physically distant. So I'm going to speak for a little while about women's suffrage in the Gilded Age, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards. And we're very glad to talk about the lecture itself and about women's suffrage in context, and then also about serving in the legislature if you'd like to talk about that as well. It's been a really wonderful adventure. So I wanted to start by talking about the Gilded Age, which occasionally one of my students describes to me as the Gilded Age, Guilded, like there were medieval guilds. It's a term that was invented really by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner in their novel of 1873, The Gilded Age. That they gave that title to the book, but it wasn't really used then. It was used. It was really a term for the era as a whole. Was used most often in the 1910s and 20s, looking back, and it's a pretty negative term. We associate the Gilded Age with a period of robber barons, of inequalities of wealth, of corruption, of sort of laissez-faire government policies of letting business do whatever it would like to do, and with stagnation and malaise. And if you go out there and you look at descriptions in textbooks and general histories of the period, they sort of dismiss politics in this period as being a bunch of noise, not really meaning anything, that the politics really didn't go anywhere. I'm going to try to situate women's suffrage in the Gilded Age partly by challenging this longstanding view of the Gilded Age, which is sort of followed in the historical scholarship with this idea that there was a progressive era that came along a little later. The person who really spoke most eloquently and powerfully about a kind of corrupt Gilded Age and a forward-looking progressive era was Theodore Roosevelt, who became president in 1901 and who tended to say, you know, before me all was darkness, and now that I'm here as president, all is light. So I think we really need to be suspicious. He was an excellent politician. Theodore Roosevelt was an excellent politician and a very good sort of framer of history. We need to perhaps be a little bit skeptical of his view of this, the negative Gilded Age and the positive progressive era. In the progressive era, supposedly around 1900, Americans kind of awoke to the dangers that the Gilded Age had presented and began to rein in the power of monopolies, enhance democracy, promote social justice and welfare, enact moral reform. And then, citizens became optimistic and forward-looking and energetic and reform-minded. So when we talk about women's suffrage in the Gilded Age, we have a little bit of a conundrum there in the scholarship saying, well, nothing was really happening in the Gilded Age except corruption, and farmers were kind of making their last stand. But if we think about it, actually, and I'm going to talk about a series of several historical problems today. And the first one is that a great deal of progressive reform happened between the 1870s and the 1890s in this so-called Gilded Age. I'm just going to walk through a few of those quickly so that you have a sense of, again, context for suffrage activism. This was an era of environmental preservation. The first national park in the world was created in 1872, Yellowstone, as Congress saw pictures of this stunning landscape and decided that it needed preservation. And you begin to see a protection of Yosemite, and you begin to see other measures to protect forests and so forth in the 1870s and 1880s. There's a little known, but I think very important movement in the late 19th century, which perhaps now after COVID, we're going to pay more attention to again, a public health movement. Massachusetts pioneered a change in the water supply in industrial cities that had been suffering a great deal from bad water that caused all kinds of diseases for children and adults. And they figured out how to put in gravel filter beds, which a couple of decades later were improved with sand layers, much cleaner water. And you begin to see diphtheria and other diseases drop, mortalities drop, even though the germ theory and antibiotics were still in the future. You're beginning to see effective action against disease. This is a cartoon from the mid 1880s when there was a big expose about the adulteration of milk that was coming into New York City. Unscrupulous sellers were taking milk and adding water and things like borax to water it down in order to sell it. And so you begin to have public health crusades on issues like, as you see in the background, impure milk and tainted fish and milk, the kinds of activism that's eventually going to lead to the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. You see antitrust activism. This is a cartoon that might appear in a US history textbook for the progressive era, but it was actually published in 1887. And it shows all the monopolists in the background sort of towering over the Senate and exercising their power. And it says in the back, this is a Senate of the monopolists, by the monopolists, and for the monopolists. So you have this rhetoric of, look, large corporations are beginning to sort of warp our democracy. And that's already happening during the post-Civil War era. And certainly it's a very robust debate in the 1880s. You have investigative and reform journalism. One of the hallmarks of the progressive era is reform, is muckraking, as they call it, muckraking journalists. But you actually have a long tradition in the prior decades of the 1870s and 1880s of that kind of journalism. And here are just a few of the most famous examples, along with a picture from a businessman who was very much inspired by Henry George's idea about a single tax on land. Henry George's Progress and Poverty was probably one of the most famous pieces of reform journalism ever, and was published in 1879. All right, so where do we put women's suffrage in this story? One of my favorite articles of all times was written by Elizabeth Israels Perry, a wonderful historian, who pointed out that if you looked at the history books, you would find that, quote, men are from the Gilded Age and women are from the Progressive era. That the Gilded Age was represented by Boss Tweed and by Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, industrial titans or robber barons, and by businessmen. And it's as if women weren't even there. Whereas all of a sudden in that moment when citizens became more optimistic and forward-looking and reform-minded around supposedly 1900, all of a sudden women show up. And she said, this is not true. There were as many women in the Gilded Age as there were in the Progressive era, and they were actually very, very active. So we want to talk about some of those reform movements. So again, we can establish some context for what women's suffrage meant. So first of all, Jane Addams' Hull House, which is perhaps one of the signal achievements of the progressive era, was actually founded in 1889 in Chicago. And it had predecessors, right? As early as some of the Southern missions during Reconstruction, in Hampton and Tuskegee, for example, and urban missions in the 1880s, working women's clubs, an array of self-help groups that were focused on helping people, including women, navigate the urban experience, particularly young workers coming to urban areas from the countryside or as immigrants and facing risks and dangers, and often finding work that did not pay sufficiently, that didn't, and were facing these urban challenges. So you see a whole array of settlements and missions, and Hull House is in some ways a culmination of those things. The standard story of Hull House is that Jane Addams went on a European tour, and she saw Toynbee Hall, which was a settlement in London, and she modeled Hull House on that. And there's some truth to that, but we also need to look at the many, many domestic experiments that she also knew about and was able to draw on. And here's one of my favorites. There was a working class woman named Jennie Collins, who before the Civil War had started out as a textile mill worker, and who eventually in 1870 created her a sort of proto settlement, like a kind of early Hull House kind of experiment in Boston. She called it Boffin's Bower, which is a reference to Dickens, from a sort of a safe place that Dickens described. I think it's in the novel Our Mutual Friend. I haven't read Our Mutual Friend, but this Dickens novel has a sort of idyllic example of a place where people take care of each other and support each other, and it's kind of a nurturing atmosphere. And she created this for working women. She wanted young women who came to Boston to have a place where they could stay overnight if they hadn't found a place to live yet, where she could create a jobs registry, where there would be a little kitchen and people could come and cook for themselves, or there'd be a meal available when times were hard, and where women could just give one another mutual aid in an urban setting, particularly working class women facing inadequate pay and all kinds of dangers of sexual harassment. And she was trying to create a community in order for women to support one another. So as early as 1870, you have this, and that kind of is a beginning point for things like Hull House later on. Women are also a part of investigative and reform journalism. I'm going to give you 3 examples. They may be people you've never heard of, but they're all, to me, exciting reformers from this so-called Gilded Age, when in fact there was a lot of ferment and activism. So Helen Stewart Campbell wrote her most famous of her books was Prisoners of Poverty. She went into urban slums and tenements, and she interviewed people about their budgets and about how they were getting by. She tried to help people strategize on how to cook more cheaply or support their families. We would call them hacks now. She was looking for life hacks, right, to help people get by. And she also consistently advocated for an 8-hour day, for safer working conditions, for better living conditions, and so forth. She called herself a teacher of survival economics. She said, people aren't not getting paid adequately. Women in particular, who are being left without a breadwinner, or who are vulnerable or just can't get a decent paying job, need help surviving. So she was a really important figure in the 1880s. She didn't quite become as famous as Jacob Riis, and I think it's because Riis had flash photography and she didn't. But her books are actually incredibly detailed accounts of people's budgets and their household management strategies and their lives. They're really powerful. Second was Helen Hunt Jackson, who wrote A Century of Dishonor, which was one of the first major, very influential critiques of US policy toward Indigenous peoples, toward Native American. She wrote, it was a very powerful book, 1881, right? And widely read, and widely hated in parts of the West from whites who were very unhappy with her critique of Native peoples at this time, of policy toward Native peoples. At this time, a lot of former abolitionists in the wake of Reconstruction were still very confidently saying that they had solved what they called the quote unquote Negro question, and sailing along to see what other questions they might be able to resolve, since they had solved slavery, problem solved, we can move on to other things. And so the so-called Indian question was one that was widely discussed, and women played a very central role in forming reform organizations and advocacy groups. And then Ida B. Wells, whom you may have heard of. There's a terrific American Experience documentary about her with Toni Morrison reading from Ida B. Wells's work. It's called A Passion for Justice. And she was really kind of a sole anti-lynching crusader in the 1890s. She was a powerful investigative journalist. She had been in Memphis, and then she was she really had to go into exile in Chicago because her life was threatened when she took on several lynching cases and proved that the supposed causes of the lynchings were not correct. And that in particular, this myth that lynching was always a response to the sexual assault or rape of a white woman by an African-American man, that this was false, and that competition in business or labor disputes or many other causes lay at the heart of cases of lynching. She had great difficulty finding allies because this was such a difficult topic, and so few white women were willing to ally with her. But she did a great deal of work on exposing these lynching cases. She toured Britain for fundraising and was a really important early journalistic advocate. She became one of the founders of the NAACP. So she's really in many ways a bridge. Her parents were born in slavery in Mississippi. She moved to Memphis and then to Chicago, and was a really important national African-American civil rights leader. I want to talk for just a couple of minutes also about the Women's Christian Temperance Union, because it's one of the most important organizations of the Gilded Age. And I think that part of the reason that we don't take the post-Civil War decades seriously as a period of reform is because maybe we think, oh, temperance, well, it was that kind of busybody thing where they tried to abolish liquor and it didn't work out very well in the 1920s and 30s. So we're going to kind of just dismiss it. But the WCTU was incredibly important at the time, and it worked for a lot of other things other than liquor regulation. Frances Willard, who was the head of the WCTU for this whole period for almost 20 years, was an incredibly charismatic speaker. And she never married. She spoke about motherhood as something that was important for all women. That mothering the race, mothering humanity, mothering the world were sort of women's natural impulses. And she had a wonderful statement: womanliness first, afterwards what you will. She understood that in her period, you needed to represent yourself first as feminine and as sort of doing the work of maternal, nurturing, domestic tasks, but that if you found a way to present yourself as a womanly woman who was doing domestic nurturing work, you could then use that to justify doing pretty much anything. So she spent her life as a lecturer, speaker, public advocate, and one of the supporters of the Prohibition Party in the 1880s, which played a pretty significant role in politics during its peak in the mid 1880s. Was not, of course, in danger of winning the presidency, but the party system was so close in the 1880s, and we can talk more about this later if you'd like, but there was so much margins were so razor thin in this period that the Prohibition Party was able to swing votes in ways that really punished the Republican Party for its failure to fully embrace the Prohibition program. What I want to talk about a little bit, though, is Willard's recommendation to women, which was do everything. And it was really a kind of open invitation to local WCTU chapters to investigate conditions in their local jail and do prison reform work, and to open lunch centers so that people didn't have to go to the saloon for lunch, That was kind of the origin of the phrase, there's no such thing as a free lunch, because saloons would put out a free lunch, which had a lot of salty foods in it. And then they would expect you to buy a beer or two or three to go along with the food. And so there were WCTU chapters that created lunchrooms. They created reading rooms, which often became the nucleus for the local public library later on. They started kindergartens. They got very interested in the kindergarten movement in Europe, and they brought kindergartens to the United States and founded many of them. They got involved in women's suffrage work, became very, very influential in kind of mainstreaming the women's suffrage movement. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But they did a broader array of things as well. So the WCTU, among other things, even though it didn't succeed in nationally prohibiting alcohol in this period, got all kinds of other interesting things going. And it also brought hundreds of thousands of women into public life and taught them to use Robert's Rules of Order and create a nonprofit organization and advocate and speak publicly in various things like that and run for office. So Frances Willard also was a feminist in the broadest sense of the term. She wrote books for young women, and when there was some controversy in the early 1890s over whether women should wear bicycles, it was thought should ride bicycles. It was considered improper. Women was afraid that if a woman rode astride, if a girl rode astride a hobby horse or a bicycle or anything like that, that would be sexually stimulating. And she said, "Oh, for Pete's sake, girls should ride bikes." And so she was fairly advanced in years at that point. I think she was in her early 60s. She said, "I'm going to learn to ride a bicycle." And she had her picture taken with her bicycle. She gave her bicycle a name, and she wrote a book about, listen, I'm Frances Willard. I'm one of the country's leading, most admired reformers, and I say girls should be able to ride bikes. So there were a range of things that the WCTU took her and other reformers in a bunch of different directions. By 1890, Frances Willard also described herself as a Christian socialist. She became increasingly persuaded that it was poverty that caused alcoholism rather than alcoholism causing poverty. And so she made an alliance with various friendly unions and the labor movement, the Knights of Labor, and became an advocate of the 8-hour day and various labor reforms. She did not bring the whole WCTU or the whole Prohibition Party with her. And when she began to advocate women's suffrage, she also didn't bring a lot of Southern white women along with her from the WCTU, but some of her more radical implications are quite interesting in the direction that they took the movement. Okay, so that was a huge whirlwind tour of why I think it's wrong to call the Gilded Age the Gilded Age, and actually we might want to abolish that term completely and think about this as a kind of long progressive era stretching from Reconstruction all the way up to the New Deal, or at least think about and acknowledge some of these reform movements, which were quite powerful and quite prominent. And I think hopefully what I've just told you has undermined the idea that there was nothing but malaise and stagnation, and politics meant nothing in the 1870s and 1880s, but that it was only when Theodore Roosevelt arrived in 1901 that citizens became sort of forward-looking and reform-minded. But in fact, this whole period was characterized by a lot of post-Civil War ferment and new ideas and new movements for innovation. I'm going to talk today about just a couple of places, because as you see, women's suffrage did not win national full suffrage in most places until later on. The 1910s is a decade when suffrage victories really accelerate. And in fact, there are a lot of referenda in the Gilded Age that fail. A lot of times that Kansas or Washington State or other places put women's suffrage on the ballot and it gets voted down. But you'll notice, I'll go back to this other slide, you'll notice that Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho are all places where women got suffrage before 1900. This was unexpected to the suffrage leaders. They were based in Boston. They were looking around at all the great things that were happening in Boston, whether it was Boffin's Bower or public health reform or many other exciting things. They were sure Boston was the center of the universe, and that if reform was going to happen, it was going to be the kinds of Republicans, capital R Republicans, who had brought about abolition, and who had brought about emancipation, and who had won Union victory in the Civil War, that those were the most progressive, enlightened folks in the country, and that they would be the first to bring about suffrage. And there was much anger and frustration about the fact that that wasn't the case. The Massachusetts Republican Party put women's suffrage in its platform for something like 20 years straight during and after the Civil War. They kept saying, yes, yes, we should have women's suffrage. And they never did it. They just kept saying, yeah, that's a great idea, sure. And eventually they just never quite got around to it. And there were suffragists who got extremely angry. One called it a series of glittering generalities, where so there's the Gilded Age again, right? The sense that we were offered glittering generalities. In the meantime, nobody expected Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho to be the first places that would give women full suffrage. So I'm going to focus on a couple of those today because I want to tell sort of two stories. One that's about the populists, and one that's about Mormonism and the Latter-day Saints. You'll notice on here that I'm skipping a couple of other stories. First of all, the story of suffrage in the Gilded Age is actually much more complicated because there were a lot of local victories, partial victories. If you look at a state like Kansas, for example, which was kind of in the vanguard in this period, women won school suffrage. So they got to vote in school board elections. In fact, women were running in many parts of the West, particularly for superintendent of schools and other school-related positions, school board type jobs. The Temperance and Prohibition movement and the WCTU advocated strongly for women to have a vote in local option elections where they were deciding whether or not to ban liquor in a particular locality. And in some places, like in Kansas, women in cities got municipal suffrage. So a true full suffrage map of the United States for women's suffrage would be almost impossible to reconstruct because there were so many different layers of partial types of suffrage. There were some places where women who were widowed and owned property, for example, might vote, but not usually for federal elections, usually on local matters. What I'm going to talk about, and I'm also skipping the Wyoming story and the Idaho story, which we can talk a little more about if you'd like, but I'm going to talk about these two places in where suffrage came about. Colorado in 1893, and then this peculiar story about Utah, which you notice is on here twice. And there's a reason for that. I'll try to explain. So let me do Colorado first. This is a little chronologically out of order. But I think that we should situate Colorado and Idaho suffrage in the context of the rise and fall of the People's Party, which was also called the populist movement, which was an economic-based movement of workers and farmers. The Knights of Labor and the Farmers Alliance were two national organizations that really built on a lot of labor activism and economic reform work in the 1870s and 1880s to call for sweeping government action to counter the rising power of corporations and the inequality of wealth, right? And here we have a cartoon from 1894 in which they're measuring the number of millionaires and the number of tramps. The Omaha platform, which is the most famous of the People's Party's statements, in its very famous preamble, spoke about how from the great womb of government injustice, we get the two classes of people, tramps and millionaires. And they said, we believe the power of government, in other words, the power of the people, should be expanded as rapidly and as far as the good sense of intelligent people and the teaching of experience shall justify, to the end that oppression, injustice, and poverty shall eventually cease in the land. It is hard to imagine a more progressive kind of statement than that. It doesn't quite fit into the narrative of progressivism starting in 1900, but here were people saying, look, we need government to do more in order to prevent poverty and to prevent injustice. And they're particularly focusing on economic injustice. Now, there were a lot of women in the People's Party. Here are two who were particularly famous from Kansas. Mary Elizabeth Lease, who I've written about some, and who was a really interesting figure. She was involved in the WCTU. She was involved in an array of different labor organization in the Knights of Labor. And she actually came from a Catholic background and had been involved in Catholic women's organizations as well. And she got involved in politics in the late 1880s. She was famous supposedly for telling the farmers of Kansas. She lived in Kansas and she stumped Kansas and helped the populists win their first big state victories in 1890 in the state of Kansas. And she was famous for having allegedly said that the farmers of Kansas should raise less corn and more hell. She said later, I've never found any evidence that she actually said that. And she told a reporter later that she didn't say it, but she never denied that she said it because she thought it was a right good piece of advice. So she clearly agreed with this. She was sympathetic to that sentiment, even if she never said it herself. And Annie Diggs, who was also came out of the WCTU, Temperance, and also labor advocate. These were just examples of the many women who got involved in the Populist Party in the 1890s. Their main goal was economic reform. They wanted to deal with wealth inequality, the rising power of corporations, and to help families who were struggling or in poverty. They also, almost all of them, advocated suffrage, and the People's Party as a whole was sympathetic to suffrage. As a new, smaller party that was trying to get onto the national scene, the People's Party needed women's support. Many of those women were suffragists, and so it tended to support that. Although at the national level, partly because the People's Party was trying to win the South, but in a broader sense because the suffrage issue was seen as sort of a side issue, the People's Party at the national level never fully embraced suffrage. Nonetheless, you had Colorado and Idaho, which were both big People's Party states in the 1890s, were both places where when the People's Party won power, it gave suffrage to women. Here's the irony of that. The People's Party won in Colorado in 1892. They gave women suffrage in 1893. And the historian Robin Muncie has written some about this. I can point people who are interested to her work on Colorado and early Colorado suffrage. And then this is an example of what happened in the election of 1894, which was a huge watershed moment. The person who did this terrific historical atlas that I love, which is just a wonderful book to peruse, looking at congressional elections. This person, when he did this in 1988, did not know that forever afterwards, Democrats are supposed to be blue now and Republicans are supposed to be red, and that's how we think about the world. So he did it the other way around. The Republicans on his maps are blue and the Democrats are red. But you'll see here that Democrats held a fair amount of power. And also, if you see those 11 populists up there in the upper map, they were strong in 1892. And this is the 1894 congressional level election. You can see what happened. The Democrats, a massive economic depression hit in 1893. And the Democrats held power and the populists held power at the state level in a number of places, and they were blamed for this massive economic crash. And so in the 1894 election, the Republicans swept into power and really held power for 2.5 decades after that, to a large degree. So that ironically, the populists gave women suffrage, full suffrage, in 1893, and women turned around and used that to vote for 3 women who became Colorado's first state legislators, who were female, and they were all Republicans. And that had nothing to do with suffrage. It had to do with the fact that everybody went to the polls and voted for populists in 1892, and then there was a massive economic depression and a lot of anger at the populists and a desire for change, and so the Republicans got elected in 1894. In an interesting way, this kind of discredited the suffrage movement, because first of all, there were a bunch of conservative writers who said, well, women's suffrage is one of those things associated with populism and those crazy radical economic doctrines, and so we don't want any of that. And populists, including Davis Waitt, who was the populist governor of Colorado, were very bitter, because his perception was, well, we enfranchised women and then they turned around and voted Republican, which really wasn't quite fair since everybody turned around and voted Republican in 1894. But nonetheless, it tainted the women's suffrage issue within the populist movement because it was associated with this shift from 1892 to 1894 in Colorado politics. And so it kind of discredited the suffrage movement within the Populist Party too. So the suffragists had it, they got caught between the parties. Some national level suffragists like Susan B. Anthony and others got very, very frustrated about political parties in the 1890s because partisanship was so strong and these economic issues seemed to sweep up everything. And the suffrage movement kept getting caught in the middle. So that's one of the stories here. The other story I want to tell is about Utah. And then we'll sort of have a kind of populist story about what happened in Colorado and Idaho and the populists, and then the switch to the Republican Party, and then the story about the LDS Church. And then you could think about these as two kind of case studies of women's suffrage. Utah, as a territory, enfranchised women in 1870. It was only the second place to do so. Wyoming had done it the year before, and Utah was the second place to fully enfranchise women. This presented a different kind of challenge for the national women's suffrage movement, leaders in the national suffrage coalition, because Mormonism was highly stigmatized. And there, in fact, the Republican Party at the national level had since the 1850s, even before the Civil War, been involved in an ongoing crusade against the Mormon practice of plural marriage. I'm not going to try to go in depth into the practice of plural marriage here, but I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about it from a historical perspective. I'm not as good on the theology, but I can do a little discussion of that afterwards if you'd like to talk about it more. I think the most important things to say here are that the idea that plural marriage, that Mormonism was intensely patriarchal and oppressive in a way that that mainstream American society was not in the 19th century. That's a false idea. Mormonism was complicated, just like other forms of religious belief were complicated. And in 1870, due to the centrality of the family in the LDS Church and due to a desire to uplift women and to view women as partners in the defense of the faith, Utah gave women suffrage. There was an ongoing debate between then and for over a couple of decades afterwards about women's suffrage and polygamy, and it was almost impossible to talk about one without talking about the other, and it's certainly impossible to talk about women's suffrage in Utah without the plural marriage issue getting mixed in. There were women like this woman, Mrs. T.B.H. Stenhouse, who was a first wife, who became very disillusioned with Mormonism and who left the church and was excommunicated and faced and wrote an expose of Mormonism, which was widely read by sort of Christian reformers who wanted to uplift Mormon women. And there was a huge campaign against Mormon plural marriage. And this is an example of the kind of cartoons out there. And there's actually a very rich scholarship on these now. I've pointed you to one book about this, but there's about 30 more. There's maybe not that many, but there's a lot of really good scholarship on this now. And based on this perception, and here's a kind of imagined Mormon household in which the Mormon husband is like a kind of this is a highly Orientalist, right? It's about sort of imagining Mormon wives being a harem, and based on this kind of stereotype of Mormonism, there are two, and the assumption that women's suffrage in Utah being given to Mormon women is furthering polygamy, it's furthering plural marriage. There are two acts passed by Congress in the 1880s. The first of which denies the vote to any Mormon who is practicing plural marriage, any Mormon man. And the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887 is much more sweeping. It withdraws women's suffrage. No one in Congress, frankly, could explain exactly why or how it was that women voting in particular in Utah was furthering the cause of plural marriage, except there was an obvious assumption that most women in Utah were Mormon and they had not used their vote to abolish plural marriage. In fact, the opposite. Mormon women from the very beginning have a sustained protest against congressional intrusion. And Eliza Snow here, and there's many others who say, no, You don't understand anything about Mormon women, and we don't need to be rescued. We do not live in harems. Plural marriage works for us. It is our faith, and we understand how, this is working for us in our households. And the suffrage, the church is our ally in having enfranchised women in Utah, and for Congress to disfranchise us because of plural marriage is ridiculous. Nonetheless, Congress acted and imposed a whole bunch of severe penalties. In essence, what happened is the federal government threatened to completely bankrupt and crush the Mormon church in the late 1880s. And although Mormon leaders had defended plural marriage stoutly, they eventually decided that they had a choice between giving up plural marriage, giving up polygamy, or just having the entire church be crushed by the federal government. And so they, in 1890, reluctantly issued something called the Woodruff Manifesto, which ended the practice of plural marriage. They then insisted that after 1890, there was a possible pathway for statehood to Utah, which eventually happened in 1896, and they insisted that women's suffrage be included. The national suffrage movement, so women were re-enfranchised when Utah won statehood in 1896, because Utah said, listen, we're not going to come back in, we're not going to come into the union as a state unless it become with women's suffrage. And so women's suffrage was re-established, and both statehood and the re-establishment of women's suffrage were dependent on the renunciation of plural marriage that had happened in 1890, so that by 1896 that had kind of cleared a path. Just to talk for just a second here again about the complexities of this. This is a picture of Susan B. Anthony with some LDS women's suffrage leaders in the mid 1890s, including, there are Mormon women among others included in this picture. The fact that the Mormon church was pro-suffrage and that Utah gave women suffrage in 1870 was a real challenge and complexity complication for the suffrage movement. If you go look at the history of women's suffrage and some of the early books that were written by suffrage leaders, Susan B. Anthony, others, compilations of documents, they sort of tend to say, all hail Wyoming, the first territory to give women full suffrage in 1869. And then they'll put in like a little asterisk, and at the bottom of the page, in tiny little letters, they'll say, and also Utah. They didn't really want to acknowledge Utah's central role in beginning to enfranchise women, because they found it to be stigmatizing, to be associated with the LDS church, and particularly with polygamy. And so they tended to downplay it. So here you have another case where the suffrage is caught between different warring factions, in this case on the issue of polygamy. And you'll see the quote from Susan B. Anthony, who tried very hard to kind of do an end run around this issue of polygamy and say, look, it doesn't matter. Look at the problems that monogamy causes women. Look at the problem that polygamy causes. They are the same. Women's dependency, in particular, her economic dependency, is the problem. And so we should get around this whole issue. And she tried to kind of skirt the issue, but that was very difficult to do. So just like suffrage, the suffrage issue was stigmatized in Colorado because the populists associated it with the Republicans and the Republicans associated with the populists. It was stigmatized because because it was associated in Utah with this hated cause of polygamy, practice of polygamy. I will just say here that one of the things this shows to me is that women have very rarely wanted the ballot just so that they can take like a little piece of paper and put it in a box. Nobody really wants to vote in a theoretical sense just to vote. People want to vote for something. They have agendas. They have class and race and regional and economic and ethnic and religious and many other identities. And so to vote has almost always meant to vote for something, to vote to protect your religious faith, to vote to gain civil rights or human rights for your people who are being discriminated against, for example, with African Americans or Native Americans. It It may involve, everything from urban voters that Jane Addams helped to organize to try to help get better garbage collection in their district, to, really grassroots kind of, we need a better neighborhood. Why the heck haven't they put in a playground, and why can't they drain my street? And why can't we make it drain properly? And why are there so many mosquitoes? That kind of level of work, which I think gets underemphasized. In New Orleans, because of childhood diseases, there was something called the Ladies Drainage and Sewerage League. And they went around door to door, and they were the ones who got the bonds passed to put in a decent sewer and drainage system in the city of New Orleans. And, on the face of it, it's not a very glamorous thing, the Ladies Drainage and Sewerage League of New Orleans. But these are women who had buried their children from diphtheria and from childhood diseases. And so there was a direct line between, getting the streets to drain properly and mourning a lost child. So I think that we need to make sure we don't think of that as kind of like side work or not very important work, whereas the national level stuff was grander and more glorious. But you have women for all kinds of reasons who wanted to vote and who got involved in movements to vote, again with a goal in mind. Usually, I don't think that there was a view that women would be completely disinterested and they would simply do what was always morally right. And if we all knew what was morally right and it was easy to figure out what that was, then we would all do it tomorrow, right? But instead, suffrage constantly was mired or caught up in these kinds of complicated debates over particular political issues. Okay, so that leads me to the last question I'm going to focus on here for just a couple of minutes before we open it up for questions and discussion. And that is to sort of question, I have sort of talked about how I think that this whole era was progressive in the sense that after the Civil War, the cause of emancipation and all the exciting reform and optimism and energy that came out of Union victory and emancipation and the possibilities of reform spirals off in all directions for decades afterwards as people ask big questions about who gets to vote, what kind of country are we now that we've won the Civil War, what role should women play, how are we going to reform this industrial economy that we've got, what role should government have in people's lives. And so I might argue that we should see the whole period between Reconstruction and the New Deal as a kind of long progressive era. But then we have to think about that term progressive. So in addition to thinking about the negative connotations of the Gilded Age, I want us to think about whether progressives were really progressive. What does progressive mean anyway? Well, the people who went out and crusaded against Mormon polygamy were quite sure that they were progressive and that they were trying to end and stamp out a practice that they thought was horrible and backward and abusive and to women. And the women in the LDS church who stood up and said, no, you don't understand anything about our lives. We don't need to be rescued. Thank you very much. Things are fine here. Had to work against that kind of condescending narrative of people swooping in to try to uplift and reform them. And that happened to Indigenous women, that happened to women who were subjected to Christian missionary activity when they may not have been interested in being converted. And yet there are other women who prove to be very receptive to those kinds of movements. But I hope by giving you a sense of where the populists and where the Mormons were here, you get some sense of this. I think that thinking about the women's suffrage movement itself, and I'm sure going to talk about this in other sessions of this class as well, we also have to think about the racial and gender implications of the suffrage movement. This is a cartoon from 1884, which has pretty ugly racial stereotypes in it. Although actually the depiction of the Chinese man is one of the less racist depictions that you might see in journals in this period. The guys in the window are an Irish immigrant and an African-American man. And this depicts women, of course, assuming that they are white, being left out of the suffrage picture when African-Americans and immigrants are able to vote, while Chinese men are left out in the cold with white women. There are, as I'm sure you know, and have talked about a little bit last time, I think, leaders of the suffrage movement, perhaps Elizabeth Cady Stanton, most notorious among them, who stood up and said, how can you possibly not have enfranchised educated, refined white women when you have enfranchised pretty much every ignorant immigrant who moves here and every African-American man in highly racially and ethnically stereotypical and prejudicial ways. And so the suffrage movement often saw itself as the white suffrage movement. They didn't say that always, although in Marjorie Sproul Wheeler's book her work will show you that in the South they did say that. Most suffragists in the South stood up and said, you need to enfranchise white women because we are the bulwark against Black votes, because that was the only argument they could get anywhere with in the South, and because they shared the racial prejudices of the white South. And so I think we need to think of suffrage itself as something that could have both progressive connotations and connotations that wouldn't look as progressive to us today. So I will end there because that was a sort of a broad-ranging look at all sort of contexts and complexities of the suffrage movement in the Gilded Age. Hopefully this explains some of the reasons why the United States didn't turn right around in the wake of the Civil War and say, yes, we're going to enfranchise African-American men and let's enfranchise women too. The stories that I've told here, the case studies might suggest why, some of the reasons why that didn't happen. But also, hopefully, I've shown that that the suffrage movement didn't just sort of suddenly emerge in 1910 and win all those state level victories, but that we had a long process of debate in which the suffrage was entangled with many other political issues that were being discussed at the time. And that sort of lays a foundation for thinking about what happened to the suffrage movement after 1900. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite questions and conversation and discussion. Very interested to hear what thoughts other people have. I think we agreed what we were going to do was take about a 2 or 3 minute break right now, so everybody can stretch and do 10 jumping jacks or whatever kind of gets our minds refocused, and then come back for questions.
That sounds like a good plan, Rebecca. We have, I would say, a half dozen or so questions for you. You're welcome certainly to look in the chat, or I can read off the questions for you if that's helpful.
That'd be
great.
And
I'm sure the more questions you'll answer, the more questions you'll get. So that'll be good.
So, it's 2:23 by my clock. Do we want to take 2 minutes to sort of do a little bit of stretching, and I'll take a look at the questions, and then we can come back and you can let me know which ones you'd like to answer in what order?
Sure.
Awesome. That'd be great. I'll be back in like 2 minutes.
All right, we'll be here. I just want to take a second to encourage anyone who hasn't yet posted a question or a comment. Please feel free to do so now in the chat, and we'll make sure that Professor Edwards can see that and get to it. Okay, thank you all.
Okay, so hopefully everybody got a little bit of a stretch and we can come back. There's so many different questions that I could I could start answering here, and I'm not even sure where to begin. I would say that several of these questions focused on immigration, and so it might be worth saying a few things about that. First of all, I don't want to imply that there were not, that racism wasn't a nationwide problem, because it was. The women's suffrage movement in the South focused almost exclusively on the enfranchisement of white women, because the enfranchisement of African-American women they saw as a complete non-starter during the Jim Crow era, and because they shared the outlook that white votes were the ones that mattered. But that is not to say that Northern women's suffrage advocates weren't also often making racist arguments. They just blended those in with a bunch of other kinds of arguments as well. So I want to make that clear. And there was a question about the votes for Debs. And that's another interesting question, because there's a debate among historians about why Debs was so successful, particularly in Texas and Oklahoma and other places. And the Socialist Party that year of the United States endorsed an anti-immigrant plank. And there is one group of historians who says that was the peak of socialism. And I think they have a point that, in fact, socialism as a broad-based strategy was pretty popular. And Debs was the most popular socialist presidential candidate who's ever run. I think he got about 1 million votes at peak. But I think it's also worth pointing out that the Socialist Party did its best, particularly in some of the heartland areas, when it adopted a plank to protect American-born labor from immigrant competition. So there's some complexity to that. So those are a couple of quick, just a little bit of responses to things that people had written in. Where, Ellen, help me out. Where should we start?
Okay, well, there are a lot of different questions here on a lot of different topics. One of the questions is to know, did Teddy Roosevelt's what am I trying to say? Was he did he have any thoughts about it? Did it come up did he take a position on women's suffrage? So I'm trying to say.
That's a great question. That's a great question. From Nancy Cohn, I think, right? And just a shout out, I noticed Peggy Stubbs, who's a Vassar graduate, and some folks who had a shout out from Williams. So people from all over the country. It's amazing. People are tuning in from
Honolulu, among other places.
I know, every state of the union, which is awesome. So, there's a kind of, there's sort of two responses to that. When Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, and during his early career, I always challenge my students when they say, well, Teddy Roosevelt believed X. It's like, well, when? Which, are you talking about Teddy Roosevelt from 1894 or 1900 or 1912 or because these are, he changed his views a lot, and that's true of a lot of people in politics. And the early Republican Theodore Roosevelt was not a women's suffrage advocate. The Republican Party from the 1880s up through the 1910s, except in a few states like Colorado, where women won the vote, and then they definitely courted women's votes and tried to incorporate them into the party structure and to champion women's suffrage. In most places, they were very, very welcome. They were very welcoming to women joining the Republican Party and helping get candidates elected. But as in Massachusetts during the Reconstruction period, where there were all those glittering generalities, that didn't really translate into support for women actually voting. So there was a kind of view of, we're the party of moral reform, we need to defeat the Democrats, and so we want women to show up and sort of wave their white handkerchiefs and be super enthusiastic and knock on doors and raise money and do the work, but we're not actually going to translate that into women's suffrage. Theodore Roosevelt around that time was very concerned about race suicide, and so he was going around the United States talking about women's the need for every American woman to have at least 4 children, because he was concerned about white population loss, and he had a bunch of other things on his mind. By 1912, when he runs on the Bull Moose Progressive campaign and he breaks away from the Republican Party, Jane Addams actually nominates him at that convention, and she and others persuade him to support the women's suffrage cause. So in 1912, the Bull Moose Progressive Party, when Theodore Roosevelt was on the third party ticket, did endorse women's suffrage.
There were a few questions about the women at various stages, women who were involved in the movement. One question when you were showing us about the various women who were leading progressive causes and before Hull House and around Hull House, what kind of educational background did these remarkable women have? Were they all of the, as we've been saying, they were primarily, with the exception of Ida B. Wells, they were primarily white women, but were they all of a certain strategic level? Were they all middle upper class, or and if they were upper class, where were their husbands in all of this?
That's a really, really great question. So, well, the marriage question, let's hold off on that one because that's another whole question. We could talk about that further. But in terms of education, so this is something that I meant to say at the beginning and didn't. So I should go back and loop back to it now, and this is a great opportunity to do that. To me, I think that there's often a mistaken view that there was not a broad-based women's rights movement before 1920, but there was something called the women's suffrage movement, and that women were only working for the vote, and then that they got to, when we get to feminism in the 1960s and 1970s, then you get a women's movement that has other priorities, but in the 19th century, it was just about suffrage. And that's just not true. If you go back and you look at the Declaration of Sentiments from Seneca Falls from 1848, certainly they are asking for suffrage, but it's only one of many, many other issues. Most of those issues involved education and access to the professions and to good paying employment on one hand. And then they involve marital coverture on the other hand, which is the practice of the legal doctrine by which a wife was legally covered by her husband during marriage and did not have separate legal personhood. And so the issue of a woman having custody of her children, right to her wages, a right to her own body, right? The whole idea of marital rape doesn't even, it begins to be kind of recognized by the late 19th century, but legally it's a doctrine that's not adopted till the 1970s. So the whole idea that a woman might make decisions about when she becomes a mother or when she, about her husband's sexual access to her body, a whole array of things like that. And again, that was my goal today in this talk, was to set suffrage in that broader context. Well, one of those things is education, right? And one of the reasons that we focus so much on the suffrage movement is because some of the other demands that were made at Seneca Falls in 1848 came true. So in 1848, they are protesting lack of educational opportunities for women. And by 1860, 61, you've got University of Iowa and other state universities beginning to admit women students. You've got Vassar and the Seven Sisters getting started. You've got schools like Oberlin and religious small liberal arts colleges that are becoming coeducational. So you begin to get education. So by the late 19th century, you do have a substantial portion of relatively affluent women who have gotten a college education. Jane Addams has gotten a college education. Many others of the rising post-Civil War generation have gotten more education than their mothers and grandmothers did, for sure. That's not always the case. Ida B. Wells went to a one-room schoolhouse, and when her parents died of yellow fever in the epidemic, she dressed up to try to look older than age 16 and got herself a teaching job. And by age 16, she was teaching in a one-room schoolhouse to try to support her younger brothers and sisters who'd been orphaned in the yellow fever epidemic. So there's a wide array here of levels of education, at least access to formal education. And there's a wide array of expectations about marriage too. There was still an assumption that Susan B. Anthony widely shared, that you could either choose a career or you could choose family, but you couldn't have both. And so Susan B. Anthony admired Ida B. Wells and was very disappointed when Ida B. Wells decided to get married, and as with other women, scolded her and said, why, you have important work to do in the world. Why are you getting married and having kids? On the assumption that you can't do both, which to a large degree was true. The supports weren't there to do both. So Ida B. Wells continued her reform advocacy, but at a much diminished level when she married and had kids. So So I think that that's an ongoing issue for all of these women. Some, like Susan B. Anthony, never married. Frances Willard never married. Some major reform figures did not marry, but others married and then tried to balance that with reform work.
And weren't there women who did marry, but just that did not acknowledge that they were married? That just, in other words, they were married, but they continued their work and never acknowledged that they were married for fear that they might be thought, as you just said, to not be as devoted to the movement otherwise.
That's really interesting because a few may have. I can't think of specific cases of that, of women who hid their marriages, but it might be.
There was one that I read about. If I could remember the name, that would be good. But
maybe you remember. Well, there's a book by my wonderful former student Vanessa May, wrote a terrific book. What these women hid is they hid domestic labor. That's what they hid. They went out to be reformers, and it was extremely dangerous to admit that you had women who were doing your domestic labor at home, taking care of your kids, cleaning your house, providing those kinds of household domestic work, and that they were underpaid, that they were doing that. So you have the irony of women going out there crusading for better pay and for uplift of the poor, who have women working at home in their households who are not making a living wage. And that kind of and there's a kind of, I mean, it's easy to kind of criticize that, and I think it's worth criticizing, but also they understood that a woman's public persona and her political efficacy depended on her maternal role, right? And on her sense of being a good housekeeper, a good wife, a good mother. And so you had to hide the fact that other women were helping you do that labor in order to maintain the public persona that would enable you to get reform to happen.
And a couple of a couple of people have saved me. Kate Kidd and Jessie Waldiger remind me that the person who I was thinking of was Maud Park. So
that's really interesting that she hid her marriage. And yes, I see Pam Madison's question. Yes, that Madame C.J. Walker was the person had the really interesting career as as a very, very successful businesswoman, one of the most successful African American entrepreneurs of the post-Civil War period, but famous for a very different set of reasons than Ida B. Wells, but both very prominent Black women.
Although, because I had done a presentation on Madam C.J. Walker, I know that she also was involved in some of the same issues in suffrage and certainly in emancipation and so on. But
she was, yes.
So there was a question about, did the movement in England influence the US movement? I'm sure it did, but if you wanted to speak a little about how specifically, that was Nina Malthus was asking.
It did. I think that the British movement had more influence later on, particularly on the National Women's Party and the militant strategies that were undertaken in Britain, that hunger strikes and militant street actions really directly influence the National Women's Party, which comes along a little bit later. So I don't think there's as much influence from Britain to the United States in the late 19th century. I'm trying to think about what that, I mean, the other way around in some ways, Frances Willard was such a charismatic and popular figure that she tours Britain and has a lot of British friends, and there's a lot of admiration in England for the work of the Prohibition movement in the United States, the Temperance movement.
Interesting. If you want to switch gears for a moment, I see that there's a message here from Nancy who would like to know about your decision to run for office and what you hope to accomplish. So if you want to, otherwise we can do that afterwards. There's still plenty of questions, but you're
sure. Why don't we see if there's any more history questions, and we'll come back to that one in just a couple of minutes, because it might likely take us in a completely other direction, which will be great. I would love to talk about that for a few minutes, but I know there were some questions about Mormon. Were there any questions about plural marriage? Because I know that it looked to me like there were a few questions, and maybe people want to repeat in the chat anything that I haven't gotten to yet that we should talk about.
Well, there was one question from Lisa who was asking if women voted the way their husbands had instructed them to vote, and specifically she mentioned the polygamists. So,
Right. So, I mean, that's one of the dilemmas when we talk about why didn't women get suffrage the way that African American men did right after the Civil War? And that's actually kind of the dilemma, right? I mean, on one hand, you could say, well, women are just going to vote the way their husbands do, so what's the point? And on the other hand, you could say, oh my gosh, they might not vote the same way as their husbands. And that was the real problem, right? They might actually think independently, and that's going to be a big problem. So that was essentially the dilemma. There was a perception that that Mormon men were controlling women's votes, and there's no real sign of that, although any more than there was among other families. But there was a joint, I mean, Mormon women joined Mormon men in a collective defense of the faith and in the interests of the church. And outsiders just weren't willing to see that as women's independent. And they sort of explained that as, well, we just can't understand why women would be in favor of polygamy. And the caricature of polygamy that was, sort of viewed from the outside, contributed to that. Just the assumption that Mormon women were being bossed around by their husbands and didn't have any independent thought. And the irony in that is that the Women's Relief Society and the women's organizations in Utah and in the Mormon Church were very strong, and that the Mormon Church sent women back to Pennsylvania Medical College for advanced education and was very interested in having women do medical work and work in nursing fields, and one of the, I really enjoy teaching this topic with my students because I think it's sort of a demonstration of some of the complexity of history. A lot of Mormon women argued that plural marriage was feminist because it gave them more opportunity to share labor and to work in the world. And so you might have sister wives who helped with childcare and helped with housework and helped with taking care of kids. And that would free up different women to use their talents out in the community. And that was welcomed by the church, which wanted women's volunteer work in the community. And so it was just very, very hard for people to see that, and to accept plural marriage as something that women might find. And plural marriage was like monogamy. Some people found it miserable and horrible, and it was a terrible experience. And others found it to be really quite satisfying. And so there was a lot of, as with monogamy, you can't really stand up and say, well, a polygamous marriage was like X, because like sort of like a monogamous marriage in 19th century America was like Y. It's not really that way. But it was such a different system that it was so, it was the prejudices against it were strong. There's a question here about Colorado, about women and voting Republican in Colorado. And it's a really interesting question. The Democratic Party had sort of gotten subsumed in Colorado at that time, and there was a huge fight predominantly between the populists and the Republicans. And this was in the middle of an enormously bitter set of struggles over unions and labor and mining. Everything in Colorado was about mining, about silver mining and hard rock mining of other kinds, and about the power of the mining companies, and about the power of workers to organize, or in a couple of cases to blow up mines in protest. It got pretty violent at times. So I think that those were really the issues that were most on people's minds. And right after the Depression of 1893, the silver market just dropped through the floor, and the Colorado mines kind of ground to a halt. And so the economic crisis was really what was on the agenda in the mid-1890s nationwide, and particularly in Colorado.
There's a question, and I think you touched on it a little before, but was there a noticeable difference between the women's movement from the southern, recently Confederate states and the northern ones?
There was, and I think this is a really interesting issue to explore further, is that there was also differences in the West and the Midwest and other areas as well. The suffrage movement in the South lagged in the former Confederacy. It was a much more of an uphill battle. In fact, when suffrage was ratified in 1920, as I don't know if you discussed this yet, but I'm sure you will, Texas did vote for women's suffrage, but there was no other Confederate state that ratified suffrage except for Tennessee, which by one vote cast the the final vote. So on the Tennessee and Texas were the only former Confederate states that ratified it. And my home state of Virginia didn't ratify women's suffrage, but then when the ERA was in front of them in the 1970s, they stood up and said, well, we're not going to support the ERA, but we'll go back retroactively and support women's suffrage. They actually went back and ratified the 1920 suffrage amendment in the 1970s. The South was very resistant. Much more than other parts of the country, and we can talk about pluses and minuses elsewhere. And I want to pick up this issue that Lisa has put in the panel as well. That I want to acknowledge. I don't want to give a completely positive, glowing review of Mormon plural marriage, because that wasn't always the case. There were some women who, in fact, found plural marriage, particularly first wives, who had not expected to be plural wives. If you became a second wife or a third wife, you from the very beginning you had certain expectations about what a plural marriage would be. But there were some first wives who struggled with it, who left the church, like Fanny Senhouse, who became critics. And I don't want to underplay that. It's just that I often find that people carry assumptions that polygamy was by nature horrible for all women and oppressive, and it was much more complicated than that. So I want to try to acknowledge views. For those of you who are interested, there's a book called The Polygamous Wives Writing Club, which explores some of the real difficulties and challenges, particularly of rural, poorer women. Women higher up in the Mormon hierarchy tended to have a better experience. People who were more affluent tended to have a better experience, and it's hard to disentangle how much that's about poverty versus affluence, as opposed to being different practices of polygamy. But it's a really complex set of issues.
So just a couple of things. Larry and Gail Volk want you to know that Virginia was the 38th state to ratify the ERA in 2020.
Yes, yay for Virginia in 2020. It's great. So now, how many more states do we need? We need one. I think I don't know if but yeah, this is in 2020, they went back to the 1970s and passed the ERA, right? So glad that Virginia is now caught up.
That's right. Well, good for you. There's a question here about asking if you can speak more about the statement that poverty drives drinking as opposed to the other way around. You mentioned that before, and did concerns about poverty and better wages get any traction?
Yes, I think it's a really great question. So yes, there was a chunk of the prohibitionists who decided, Frances Willard being by far the most famous and prominent of them, who decided by the late 1880s that they had sort of been looking at the wrong end of the problem, and they'd been focusing on alcoholism as a moral problem. And a problem of sort of personal character, and that actually, and they had been sort of dramatizing the fact that alcoholism caused poverty, which is the case, right? I mean, they were telling very real stories about women whose husbands went straight to the saloon on Friday when they got their paycheck and drank up the paycheck, and the kids were starving, right? I mean, alcoholism is a real and visceral problem. But that they also, and they really weren't quite ready to talk about alcoholism as a disease yet, as an illness, as something you could diagnose and treat. But they began to talk about poverty as a cause of alcoholism. And Willard is very articulate about this, and she tries to move the entire WCTU and the entire prohibitionist movement into alliance with the Knights of Labor and the labor movement, and to advocate for an 8-hour day. And she begins to call herself a Christian socialist, and to begin talking about the need for living wages and for economic reform and for government action to alleviate poverty. And it's almost like you can see her, you can read some of these speeches and you can almost hear like everybody in the audience just kind of squirming in their seats. Because the prohibitionist movement originally came out of a very business-oriented, pretty conservative, capital R Republican, party that emphasized business interests, and most prohibitionists were former, am I going to say this? Yeah, most prohibitionists were former Republicans. Their goal, they gave up on the Democrats. and really wanted to change the Republicans to make the Republicans fully prohibitionists. And there were a couple of states like Maine and Iowa where Republicans did in fact enact prohibition. And they wanted other Republican parties to do the same, and they couldn't get them to do it because the Republicans thought that it was an issue that was not a successful issue for them. So she just didn't bring most of the party with her. She brought a chunk of the party, of the Prohibitionist Party, and a chunk of the WCTU with her. And a lot of others were just not willing to make the leap to think about those economic reforms. But there was a big effort in 1892 to merge the Prohibition and the Populist Party and the Knights of Labor and the Farmers Alliance into this grand reform coalition, and they couldn't quite bring it together.
So there's another question from Kate Kidd, actually, since we're on the subject of alcohol. Was there an understanding of PTSD after the Civil War and alcohol? Or is there any new scholarship that might link these issues?
I think it's a great question. And I think the answer is not really. I think that they began, I mean, if there's new scholarship, I don't know of it. I don't want to say no, because there very well may be. There's some really interesting scholarship on alcoholism and understandings of alcoholism, but they didn't understand PTSD as we understand it, or even what they called after World War I shell shock. They didn't quite have the same view of it, but they did understand that a lot of veterans were getting their pension checks, and that saloons and were catering to that. And so the WCTU, some of the early WCTU actions and the creation of the Temperance Union had to do with anger and frustration at what they saw as the exploitation of Union veterans and Confederate veterans too, who were suffering from who were disabled and suffering.
So there's a different question now from Dale Fink, who's saying, is it possible that women voted Republican in Colorado because the Dems were the ones suppressing Black freedom? The Repubs may not have been as progressive as the Populists, but better than the Dems.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, but to my knowledge, and I'm happy to be proven wrong, I'm not sure that anybody in Colorado was debating the issue of African-American suffrage. Not much at all. And by the 1890s, there are very few Republicans at all who were defending African-American voting rights. The last big push comes in, when is the Lodge bill passed? I'm going to miss my year here, and I ought to know. There's a huge effort. Charles Calhoun has a really great piece on this in his book about the Republicans. They make a last-ditch stand to try to pass an amendment that would allow local citizens to petition the federal government if they feel like they have been disfranchised. And it's Western Republicans actually who step in and say, no. Some of you Northeastern Republicans still think that you're the party of abolition, but that is the past. We are not interested in, racial justice. That's not who we are. And furthermore, you're going to open up a can of worms about Chinese voting and Asian voting, and we do not want Asian citizenship here on the Pacific Coast. And so actually Senator Stewart of Nevada, who was originally from Virginia, but is a Republican, contributes votes to squash this Lodge Amendment. So they come very close to passing a federal elections bill that would have enabled the federal government to play a more robust role in protecting African-American voting rights. And it's members of the Republican Party who crush that. There's I think a Vermont Republican who says, think about it. Nevada, which barely has enough people to constitute a respectable county, has just completely destroyed the party of abolition and emancipation. And by the 1890s, there just really is very little forward motion in the Republican Party on the issue of African-American voting rights.
Okay, so
and then people have figured out how many states we need for the ERA to pass. So that's kind of cool. So yeah. Another piece there. So do we want to go back and talk about me running for office, or do you have other questions history questions here?
Well, since we have a few minutes past 3, if you don't mind, we can continue with some of the questions that have come up. But I'm not the only one, I'm glad to hear, that does want to hear about that. So we'll make sure that no later than 3, we switch topics. But Barbara would like to know what your thoughts are on Josephine Dodge, who organized against suffrage and also organized day nurseries. Are you familiar with her?
I honestly don't know very much about Josephine Dodge, but I can say that the anti-suffrage arguments are quite interesting and worth exploring and thinking about in a class like this. There were a lot of women who did argue. They did say basically, they had a sort of argument based and grounded in 19th century domesticity, saying women are not self-interested, they're self-sacrificing, their job is to be, they're not looking for a career, they're not looking for a job in politics, they don't want elected position, and our job is to be disinterested and to be a kind of moral force in politics. It's a little bit of a sort of, you know, woman on the pedestal, angel of the home kind of argument translated into electoral politics. And so they were very worried that when women got the vote, that it was going to sort of change that. And women would, gosh, they would want to run for office. And they would, you know, they would in other ways sort of be tainted or corrupted by self-interest in the ways that men were. And so a lot of the anti-suffrage arguments made by women were around sort of preserving women's unique role in electoral politics, which they saw as sort of being, you know, sort of coming in from above. But the thing that sort of belied that was that women, long before they had suffrage, were deeply involved in party politics, right? They were out there marching and fundraising and, you know, writing letters to the editor and giving stump speeches and all this. So women weren't looking very nonpartisan. And that sort of undermined the argument that they were going to be nonpartisan, since they, you know, they didn't have the vote yet, but they were already being fairly partisan. So,
but they're a little bit under the radar. Maybe that was the point, but.
And there's some people who are asking about early childhood education, which is a real passion of mine. So I want to just, I mean, I think kindergarten and day nurseries and things like that were a huge progressive issue. And that went along with, somebody was talking about how Williams College folks were involved in milk protection. There were a lot of people who got involved in pure milk supplies for kids. I mean, these were natural outgrowths of the art. If you're going to say, we women need to engage in municipal housekeeping and we need to carry our maternal role into the public sphere, the first thing people are going to look at is, you know, motherhood, right? And protecting children. And so there was increasing advocacy for day nurseries and for various kinds of maternal you know, sort of structures to support working women, working class women, and also you know, kindergartens for all children. So there's a kind of dual track there between kindergartens to sort of help children's intellectual development at an earlier stage, and day nurseries to help working mothers who needed daycare. And as it was pointed out, not all of the women who advocated for those things were suffragists. Some were anti-suffragists too.
Okay, well, I think I got most of the questions that were in the chat, with apologies to anyone that I missed. I'll say that up front, but since we are close to 3, if you would like to tell us a little bit about why and how you became involved in politics, I'm sure we'd all be interested to know.
Sure. I mean, to put my own partisan hat on for just a second, when Trump was elected, I went to the Women's March in Washington, and I came back and I joined a meeting here of the Dutchess Democratic Women's Caucus, where there were a whole bunch of people piled into a room saying, you know, okay, now what do we do? And I thought I was going down there to help maybe do some research or fundraise or whatever was needed. And a friend of mine who had previously been comptroller of Dutchess County stood up and said, we need candidates. We need people to run. We need people who are willing to get out there and run. And a couple of friends who had come with me sort of looked at me, and then I realized I was in trouble because I had asked the wrong question at the wrong time. So and I think it's still true. And I will say that one of the things I've found is that a lot of men will show up and run for office and they won't worry too much about how qualified they are, and that women are much more reticent. And I've heard over and over, oh, I'm not ready, I don't know enough. Sometimes it's just, you know, it's not the right time in my life. I have small kids. I've got other responsibilities. I'm taking care of my mom. So many different reasons why women aren't able to run for office. But often it's just a sheer sort of not feeling prepared and feeling vulnerable, and, you know, being worried about what it means to get out there and run for office. And I have to say, it was really kind of fun running for the first time in 2017, because everybody and their sister was running and brother and cousin and niece. And so, I mean, everybody was really upset about Trump. And so instead of sort of saying, I think I want to run for office, and having people say, well, why would you want to do that? Everybody just said, basically me too, or how can I help, or I know this videographer, or like I'll do the social media, right? So it was it felt very sort of movement oriented. So I'm now getting ready to run for my third term this year,
Good for you.
am the minority leader in the Dutchess County Legislature, and I love it because it's really it feels like it's a very human level. We have a huge opioid crisis that we need to deal with. We need to work on climate change. I'm working on early childhood education to try to expand affordable childhood education. We have a housing crisis. They're really real big issues, but on a scale where Dutchess County has 300,000 people in it, and that seems kind of overwhelming sometimes, but a lot less overwhelming than like trying to figure out how to solve things on a national or global scale.
So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off,
No, not
but
at
so
all.
now I have a question. I have a question for you that relates to what you just said, because I'm very interested in this. So as a woman in the legislature, do you find that and for the other women who may be in the legislature as well, does the fact that you're a woman impact what you're able to do? Or are you addressing issues that might not have been addressed otherwise? Or what does being a woman in the legislature change, if anything?
That's a great question. I mean, honestly, what seems to most impact my life in the legislature is being in the minority. I think, are you the majority party or not? We're trying to change that this year. That's the thing that ultimately determines how much power you have and how much you can accomplish. I don't know. We have a fabulous comptroller in Dutchess County who's a woman and who's very good at working across the aisle. And I think a certain amount of sitting down and listening, and a lot of the work of a legislator is just to kind of connect people, listen to what this person's doing, listen to what that person's doing. Gee, you folks haven't ever talked to each other before. You should, trying to problem solve all those things. I feel like women, I don't want to make any sort of stereotypes, but that's, that women are used to doing that kind of work. I've felt very, I've worked with terrific men and terrific women in the legislature. I wish we had more women in the legislature. And in particular, we need more women of color. We're succeeding more in getting more men of color into office, but we're working on it. But I think that the challenges that face women going into politics are quadrupled for women of color in a lot of cases. And so it's a real effort, and we need to make a deliberate effort to bring in all our sisters into politics. And that's a big job, and it's going to be a long-term job to make sure that we support a diverse array of women and a diverse set of voices.
Well, we appreciate you doing your part, and those of us here in Massachusetts and the rest of the country have to do our part as well. So
thanks. It's really fun. I mean, I have to say that I had a lot of trepidation about, is this the right thing to do? And when you run for office, you don't have any idea what it's like to actually serve in office, because they're two completely different jobs. You really have to learn two jobs. First, how do you run for office? And then how do you then stop running for office and actually try to govern? But both of them to me have been fascinating and really tremendous opportunities to just meet people and get to know the community and hear a lot of different perspectives and to learn. If there were easy answers to the problems we're trying to solve, then they would all be solved. So a lot of it's about just trying to understand the complexity of what causes the problems we're facing and how to try to figure out how to get back out of the problems we're facing. So,
well, if you do as good a job in the legislature as you've done today, I'm sure that we're all in good hands. So we're getting a lot of thank yous at this point. And I remember hearing you say that you needed to be on another call at 3:15. So it's 3:04 by my computer. I just want to make sure that I thank you on behalf of all of our hundreds of OLLI attendees today, and thank our audience for attending as well. I'm happy to stay on if you are as well, Rebecca, but I don't want to, keep
That's
you
fine.
here if you have to be somewhere.
I've got 5 more minutes if people have more questions or things that they want to ask, but
Okay.
just thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure, and appreciate all the questions and, different alleyways that the conversation went down was just really great. And thank you to the people who've been posting resources and information in the chat. That's been terrific too, to kind of keep the conversation going. And I hope this contributes to, I think you have 3 more class sessions, right? So I hope this kind of sets up a kind of move into the 20th century as you explore where the suffrage movement went after the Gilded Age.
This has been terrific. And We did mention your books at the beginning, and everyone who's attended will get a copy of the recording so they can
Terrific.
think more about this. And
The-
we really do appreciate it. This has been great. And
Thank
I'm
you.
glad to find someone who talks more quickly than I do. I was raised in New York City, but you're doing doing a great job.
I tell my students that they get more for their education dollar because I talk fast. So
There you
that's a lot
go.
of my lectures. But yeah, and I just wanted to say that a final irony about this lecture is that my most recent book was New Spirits, which is a history in which I tried to sort of deconstruct the whole idea of the Gilded Age and try to rethink this as a period where we have all kinds of heroes and movements and ideas that we should be sort of resurrecting and thinking about. And then when I published it, Oxford University Press said that no one would know what it was about unless it had Gilded Age in the title. So it's called New Spirits, Americans in the Gilded Age. And I insisted on putting the Gilded Age in quotation marks, but it's there in the title. So that was, if anybody's interested in a kind of general exploration of the era and some themes in the era, that's was what I was trying to do. So. Thank you again so much. This was such a pleasure to virtually meet you and to work to talk with this group. I really appreciate the opportunity so much.
Well, we appreciate you, Rebecca. Thanks again for coming. And thank you again to the audience. So
best wishes.
So take good care.
Bye-bye.